Good day, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Alan Paton annual lecture here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. On behalf of Library Services and the Special Collections, I extend a warm greeting to you. Special mention is Prof. Neil Kurbanali, our Acting Dean of Research from Research and Innovation at UKZN, members of the Executive Management, members of Senate, academics and professional staff, members of the Library Advisory Boards, the Library Director, Dr. Notlantla Mtobo, alumni, students, political, businesses, and religious leaders, the media, family and friends, and distinguished guests, all protocols observed. So the Alan Paton Annual Lecture has become a cornerstone of intellectual engagement within our institution, providing a platform for meaningful discussions on pressing topics that shape our world. We are deeply honored to have with us today our esteemed guest speaker, Professor Debbie Whelan, who is an academic from the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. She has lectured in a number of institutions in South Africa, including the Durban University of Technology. She is an author of a number of journal articles, working as an interdisciplinary researcher, and works between architecture, history, and anthropology, considering these elements to be immutable. Her main area of interest is KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, in which she has lived and taught for many years. She continues to carry out land restitution work in the province. So we are truly privileged to have her insights guide this year's lecture. At UKZN, we believe in fostering a culture of learning, collaboration, and inquiry. Events like this allow us to come together as a community to expand our knowledge, exchange ideas, and be inspired by new perspectives. This year's title is Controversial Clerics and Rambunctious Rebels, the Unlikely Association of James Allison and Langabalele come to Kulu, which is both timely and significant. So I encourage everyone here today to engage with the lecture, ask questions, share your thoughts, and reflect how the discussions can contribute to your own academic or personal growth. Once again, I thank you for being part of this special occasion. And let us now officially begin the program by inviting Prof. Whelan to take the stage. Thank you.
Many thanks, Rashini. Good morning to you all. I'm actually very privileged to be doing this lecture because UKZN is my alma mater, but also the connection that I have with research in the province, and particularly with the Alan Paton Centre and the Kelly Campbell collections, is really important in how we're sort of developing our work. So I'm going to share my slides, as I'm sure you are expecting. So share. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for having me. It's a really nice full circle, and this paper is also a bit of a full circle in some of the work that I've been doing in KZN through the years. So it's really about putting people that we wouldn't expect together, and I think that we spend so much time sort of working with history and working with historiographies that we forget that they're actually human relationships which are created in the journey. So I'm really talking about James Allison, who was a controversial Wesleyan minister, and he established a number of mission stations in Natal in the 19th century, and particularly he was noted for his expulsion from the Wesleyan ministry in Edendale. He was a milliner. He'd crossed the subcontinent. He'd started off on the West Coast, and he dragged converts with him as he went. And this was particularly interesting in the way in which he took, or he sort of agglomerated and a sort of significant number of Sotho people, taking them through Swaziland and then bringing them down to KZN. So part of his journey to ultimately settle in Natal took him through the upper Mzanyati, around Utrecht. Here he stayed for a while with Hlubi chief Langali Belele, later to achieve notoriety, and I'm using that word carefully, in the colony for his uprising in 1873 as a result of his people, disregarding the gun laws which existed at the time. So in the colonial Natal, Africans were not allowed to have guns unless they had a particular license. So this particular moment of meeting Langali Belele was a link which perpetuated connecting the Hlubi chief with the missionary and ultimately forming indirectly a heritage of resistance moving into the 20th century. So I must have the caveat that this is a very interdisciplinary paper, and it's an interdisciplinary paper which comes from a series of fragments from the past in different experiences and different projects that I've worked on, which have come together in a sort of bricolage, which for me, it becomes quite an interesting story. So we've got a number of different sources. My starting point, of course, was John Wright and Andrew Manson's seminal work on the Hlubi chiefdom in Natal, and this was coming out of Andy Manson's dissertation, but then also a much earlier document written by Gordon Mears about Reverend James Allison, the missionary, and these two texts are quite different in the way that they approached the historical story. So there's that. Long before this, I was part of a project through Amarfa. I've worked at Amarfa for a number of years, and I'm still connected with Amarfa in a lot of ways. But I was working with a project in Amarfa where I started a community-based earth restoration project at Georgetown and Edendale. And so Georgetown and Edendale was set up by James Allison in the early 1850s. And the story will sort of come out a bit further along that. But it's essentially a mud brick mission village, which was largely built by African Amakowa, and many of these were people that he'd brought along with him in his trip across the subcontinent. For me, this was really important as an architect. I had done I was an ICOMOS intern in the United States working on community-based projects, looking at fixing up 16th century adobe churches, and I was engaged with trying to start a similar project here. And this particular building is the house of the Imsamungs, which was also a really key part of trying to get this particular project going. So these sort of connections with the Imsamungs, with Edendale, with Earth Brick was another starting point. But significantly, what came out of this particular project and the restoration of some of the buildings was also another project I did for the Natal Museum in about 2006, which was starting to put together some of the freedom projects around Pietermaritzburg. And in this particular project, I learned that that Richard and Selby Imsamung were the sons of Langali Belele's daughter. So there are all these little bits of bricolage which are coming together. And then, as some of the discussion which happened just before the lecture started, I've also been, again, serendipitously involved in land claims and restitution work in Natal, which I've been doing since about 2006, 2007. And the particular position in all of this work is to take the position of what the documents say. So it is evidentiary, it's working on producing documents for the court. And one of the projects I had to do was working on the Hlubi land claim, which is in the Kalenzo district. And this particular project led me to another particular project, which was about making a man a king. And so working with the ethnography of the Hlubi, having this whole amount of information about the lineage of Langalibalele also led me to being able to put together thinking about how one could practically make somebody a king. But sadly, in KZN, the sort of stranglehold of the Nhlapo Commission makes that quite difficult. So working this stuff out, on the one hand, we had all of the information about the Hlubi. There was the work by Manson, by Wright and Manson, but also a really useful thesis by Selby Khadebe about orality and the Izimbongi of the Hlubi and the purpose of the Izimbongi, and a revisionist repositioning and also implicated oral studies. And on the other hand, we had the sort of historic celebration of the settler discourse, and this was looking at Allison through the lenses of Mears and Sheila Mankies. And so typically in South Africa, because this is what always happens, we have to sit in the middle ground. And for me, a lot of this came into working with social cohesion. So my experience on the Edendale project, for example, refers. Social cohesion is something I've been thinking of quite a lot, particularly around these community-based projects. And the problematic things about social cohesion is that it's really, really difficult to achieve when there are so many disparate ideas, value systems, positionings within the country particularly. But at the same time, understanding some of the relationships which happened in the past, like that between Langalibalele and James Allison, can help us start exploring these gray areas. And they are uncomfortable stories, but they're stories which exist, and they're stories we should begin acknowledging. So with these community projects, I started looking at social cohesion, and I found that at the time, the Department of Arts and Culture set up a national department of social cohesion, and this was set up after the xenophobia in 2012, and it was to try and address these dislocated relationships. However, part of the problem is that the premise of social cohesion is based on imported ideas, which are usually quite palatable in countries in the global north. So then to come to the Hlubi particularly, and the Hlubi have had a lot of celebration. Langalibalele's uprising was significant, not only in KZN, but also abroad. But the relationships of the Hlubi people, not only with the missionaries and Shepstone, but also the relationships with the Zulu chiefs or the Zulu kings, is also quite significant. So if we think back to 19th century Natal colony, we had polities which were scattered around the province or around the colony, and these polities swelled and reduced as different people gained power. But certainly, if we're starting to look at the Hlubi area prior to 1873, which is when the Langalibalele uprising was, for many years the Hlubi were based around Utrecht. Now, Langalibalele's father was Mthimkhulu. Mthimkhulu's father was Bungan. And in the time of Bungan, there was an event which is widely known to the Hlubi as Izwekufa. And this Izwekufa, the scattering, the splitting of the atom, is an event which happened as a result of the disruptions in the early stages of what we call the Mfukane, and people moving backwards and forwards across the region. But certainly in the time of Shaka, the relationship with the Hlubi was very important. Shaka saw them as a polity which was beneficial to him. They were sufficiently at arm's length that they were not a direct threat to the Zulu kingdom as it was at the time, and they were basically his guards on the periphery of his colony. So the relationship with Shaka was really quite strong. Then when it came to Dingaan, Mtunkulu was the person who was leading the Hlubi at the time. Dingaan wasn't so keen. And certainly by the time of Langalibalele, who was appointed as chief in the time of Mpande, the significant disruptions meant that he had to move into Natal. And so they crossed the border of the colony into Natal in about 1843. So Langalibalele Kamthimkhulu was quite an individual. From the early years of Mpande's reign dates the first written description of Langalibalele and his children. So much of this comes from Wright and Manson, but also the original writing of James Allison's diary. So in May 1844, the Wesleyan missionary James Allison passed through Hlubi country, this is up at Utrecht, on his way from the mission amongst Sekonyela's Tlokwa to the Swazi kingdom. So James Allison was moving across. He and his party rested for several days at Langalibalele's residence, where he noted the grass was very high, as there were no cattle to eat it. This was probably a deliberate exaggeration. A more likely picture is that the Hlubi had lost some proportion of their cattle to the Zulu depredations and had dispersed the remainder in the they'd basically seized them to conceal them in the event of further raids. So Langalibalele was described by Allison, and you'll have to excuse me for moving this, as a fine-looking young man of about 30. In conversation with his visitor, he expressed a desire to have a missionary permanently stationed in his country. Like many other African chiefs of the time, he was increasingly feeling the need for a knowledgeable advisor to guide him in his dealings with his new British and Boer neighbors, and he probably also felt that a missionary living in his territory would provide some sort of safeguard against further Zulu attacks. And interestingly enough, I'm working on another situation at the moment in which the compromised moment in which many of these 19th century chiefs were inviting missionaries to come and support them and their people is quite significant. So he moved into Natal around 1849, and he settled with his people in the foothills of the Berg. So Allison seems to have encouraged the Hlubi chief to pursue his wish, because when Langalibalele had moved into the foothills of the Berg, he sent a party of envoys on the 1,000-kilometer journey to Grahamstown to try and get the Wesleyan missionaries to come and send somebody to work amongst the Hlubi. But sadly, this was not to be, and in the end, the Berliners were invited to set up a mission station in the Hlubi lands. So some quite evocative pictures, which are from Wright and Manson's book, of the Hlubi and the extent of their settlement. They became very successful gardeners in an area which was largely dominated by old Dutch farms, which were largely ran to cattle. And so they were able to produce sufficient amount of food, certainly for many of the farms around there. So Langalibalele had a number of daughters, and this is quite important because these daughters then become the thread of how the Langalibalele's relationship with James Allison in Edendale happened. But now we need to look at James Allison moving to Edendale. So Allison started off on the west coast, as I said earlier. He then went across to around Cathcart. He moved up to north of Lesotho. He moved to Swaziland. He then came down to Indaleni, to Richmond, where he set up Indaleni Mission. And as a result of not owning land, the mission was basically suspended, and Allison moved into Edendale and purchased the property Velverdiend on which the mission was established. And the entire premise of the security of land was one of the underpinning understandings of the setting up of the mission at Georgetown. So Allison was quite an interesting character. Certainly, Mabonsa of the Hlubi said that he Allison had come and built a reed hut in the district. He'd built a similar structure in the Putini's district, and then among the Kubeka, and then at Mahamba. He used to preach to the effect that all of our ancestors would certainly rise from the dead. This caused commotion and contention in Swaziland. Later on, he went to Segonyelas. His name was Umneli. After Allison preached of people rising again from the dead, we found that no one did so. We could not understand how it could be. He said a white cloud would appear. He said many things. He caused Swaziland to come to grief, for he said Sabuza would rise again. He could not tolerate anyone laughing at him, for he said he was speaking seriously. And so the missionary endeavor was almost at some times on a point of madness. But certainly the Edendale mission set up in the early 1850s was land which was purchased. This is an early image of Edendale mission, but by 1855, Allison was basically thrown out by the early missionaries. And these are people such as the Chief Mini, people such as the Msimangs, and other significant personages. So Allison was thrown out. He moved across and set up another mission at Mpilweni, and then Edendale continued to grow. And this for me is really important because the agency of the growing of the mission allowed for a rather uncomfortable history, certainly for the citizens of Pietermaritzburg, where they had on their periphery a really successful Black mission settlement. So Allison became less and less connected with the mission settlement of Edendale, and the mission settlement itself became a thing. So at the mission, the missionaries built a church. You can see the image on the left-hand side, the monument to the Edendale Light Horse from the battle in 1879. At Isandlwana. You can see the image of the early settlement of Edendale, and this is from about 1890. But also significantly, they established a whole variety of income-generating projects, particularly one of them, which was the Wicker Works, and the Wicker Works was significant to the point that most of the wicker that was produced at the Edendale Mission was produced was sold in Natal, but then also far as field as Cape Town. At the same time, the missionaries at Edendale had the foresight to be able to start creating newspapers, to start being able to put their voice into print. And so Inkanyiso Yase Natal was started by the missionaries. It lasted for about 10 years, but certainly became a really important point of connection between the Amakolba settlement of Edendale and certainly the stronger cities of Durban and Pietermaritzburg of the time. And in this, the Amakolba, who were in Edendale, they were significant market gardeners. They were they created trade routes across the province in order to be able to distribute their goods. They demonstrated significant concern about the arrival of the railway, as they felt that this new form of transport would upset their entire income generation. So the discourse of and the power that the people in Edendale had in the region was quite significant. So when we are looking at the relationship between Langaliba Lele and James Allison and the mission, the most significant thing for me is at the time of the rebellion, Langaliba Lele sent his daughters to the mission in Edendale. He sent them to the mission in Edendale because he understood the mission and its connection with James Allison as an important vector in protection, but also relationship. Langaliba Lele, as we know, was then incarcerated at Robben Island, and after his incarceration ended, he was put into the care of Chief Teteleku, who was one of the witnesses in his trial. And Chief Teteleku sat just on the other side of the Msunduzi River from the mission. So Langaliba Lele could see his daughters could see the Msimangs growing up, and thus forms a really, really important part of the historical story of KZN. So to conclude, this paper has provided a point of intersection in relationships with people in the past. Whilst the power balance may have strong location in historical perceptions of paternalism and hierarchy, the intersection of people for various reasons remains. So the Department of Arts and Culture's Declaration on Social Cohesion assumes a general series of points of commonality in order to understand the goal of working together for the attainment of shared goals designed and agreed upon to improve the living conditions for all. Perhaps re-looking at points of intersection of individuals in the historical record may begin to solve the itch for understanding who we are as a people, a group and a nation, and allow in part for addressing the extreme polarization implicit in the current education system and in a time of aggressive renationalization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sorry, that was a bit quicker. It was all those threats of 30 minutes that I just rushed through it. So some bits probably didn't come out as clearly as they should have. I apologize.
Okay. But anyway, that is my role to tease them out. So I'd like to thank you for a truly thought-provoking and illuminating talk. As a Pietermaritzburg person, I'm ashamed to say that there's a lot in your talk that I didn't know about. And I just want to say to the members of the audience, I'll give everyone a chance shortly, but I do want to ask a few questions.
Absolutely fine.
So I'm interested to understand why you say why is the focus on the friendship between Langa Libalele and Reverend Allison? Why is that so important? What is the thrust of your argument that you're trying to make?
So I suppose the thrust of my argument is that I think that diagram that I showed where we're looking at the sort of revisionist histories of the 1980s, which is around Manson and around understanding the Hlubi, but then also some of the settler discourse. So these things are almost in their own sort of threads. And I think that much of what we have tended to do is sit as historians or as intellectuals within paradigmatic, I'm trying to think of a word, the Poles would say cathedrals, okay, within paradigmatic disciplinary areas without allowing ourselves to see the spaces in between. And I think that for me is, and it's come through in the land claims, the work that I'm doing at the moment, allowing ourselves as South Africans to realize that we actually need to explore the spaces in between and celebrate those, rather than sit within specific areas of discourse, is actually becoming more and more important. And I'm finding this in a lot of the land stuff that I'm working with, particularly with the legislation and the way in which restitution is playing out in the courts, that occupying that gray area has to sort of start being acknowledged by the academy, for example.
Okay.
Can you?
Yes.
It's a difficult sort of, yeah. So living in that space in between, which is what we instinctively do, but then we still externalize sort of parallel worlds.
Yes, I understand. It's kind of polarizing people and making it seem as though, black was always against white, and therefore the worlds never met.
Absolutely.
And what you're trying to show is a kind of coming together of people from very different worlds trying to promote their own people and their own missions in life.
Absolutely. And I mean, the relationship between Shepstone, for example, and the Amakosi was a very different power relationship to, I suppose, a much more nuanced relationship of Alison with the Amakolwa, and the need for the missionaries to become part of how chiefs set up their spaces. So it's really working at a very parallel level rather than at a hierarchical level of Shepstone being the Mnumzan, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So it's, and I mean, I suppose I also say this having come from DUT, where our students, particularly in the last few years I was at DUT, and the EFF came into the SRC, they started taking over the SRC, is the students became increasingly politicized, that the grey areas of the past did not exist. And the schools don't teach about the grey areas of the past. So I think it's being able to sort of start acknowledging those again as part of an Ubuntu discourse, if that makes sense.
Okay.
They might not be comfortable, but they are precedent. Okay.
I was quite interested, because recently when we held the Alan Paton Literary Festival, we had students from Georgetown who've written a memoir of the school. And, we always read in newspapers, certain places in South Africa almost become places of the heart, iconic names in South African discourse. And one never really knows why, but listening to you, what struck me was the origins of Edendale. And maybe since you rushed through it, but maybe if you can just tease that out a bit slower for us, because people of my generation, we almost think that Edendale was a place like in Pietermaritzburg, like Northdale, when the group areas came, that people were moved to these areas that did not exist. So I'll open that out to you.
So now that you're inviting me to do that, so Welverdiend was the original farm name of Edendale. And Welverdiend was one of 6 farms that were granted to Andries Pretorius by the Volksraad. And Andries Pretorius, as we know, was one of the trekker leaders. But certainly when the British arrived, many of the trekkers left the province and went north, or left the colony and went north to the Transvaal. And so when Alison arrived, he was able to purchase significant parts of the farm and then be able to have secure tenure for his followers. And this was really important for him because he felt that if you owned the land, then you actually had tenure. You couldn't be thrown off it. Part of the reason why the significant ejectment of Alison happened was around the different perceptions inland between what he saw as sales and how people saw them occupying the land. And so when he left in 1855 and went to start in Pulweni, which is the sort of date I remember, the Edendale mission continued to grow. And the Edendale mission continued to grow as under the Amakolwa. The Black missionaries in Edendale built the village out of mud brick, which for me, I got very excited about. But certainly they managed to expand in order to extend the mission. They started a mission at Sadara, and then they also started, they purchased land up at Rusboom and Driefontein and continued their missionary endeavors around the Ladysmith area. And certainly a lot of the missionaries, the Amakolwa from Edendale, also purchased properties in the Underberg area at the time of the release of land in the 1880s, 1890s. So they were incredibly successful entrepreneurs. The other thing which is also really important about Edendale is that it wasn't only a Black community. You saw earlier the image of the Wicker Works, which was run by Stanley Hodges. Kay Nixon, if anybody remembers Kay Nixon from UKZN, grew up at Edendale. Bunny Bula, who is from Pietermaritzburg, grew up in Edendale. And so the forced removals in Edendale was actually about white and Indian people having to move to Northdale, for example, but also white people having to move to the city, so that it became a scheduled area. So from my point of view, it's an incredibly rich area of knowledge. Not only the Msimangs came from Edendale, but also people like Traluza, Dambuza, who was a significant chief in the 19th century. It really was an important mission for me as much as Inanda and as Adams. Unfortunately, the Msunduzi municipality didn't necessarily have the impetus to be able to support any significant development of the mission and carry on the project with the museum. And this was largely because of politics. And this basically has meant that Edendale has been left, which is a real shame.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose the discourse around Edendale amongst politicians is always around economic upliftment, rather than focusing on heritage and tourism and those kind of. But I'm interested when I saw that first photograph that you put up of the mud structure. And I wanted to ask you, because you said you worked for Amafa, do we know whether that building has survived today?
So it was originally Allison's house, and then it passed into the hands of the Msimangs. And I was working with Lorenzo Msimang, who had tenants in there 20 odd years ago, in order to be able to repair it and then turn it into a museum. And interestingly, my second PhD proposal was about community-based development of the mud brick mission village in Edendale. And it was trying to sort of knowing that these things they can't live with a person, they have to live with an institution. I was trying to work with the city council in order to be able to take over the project and manage it. And certainly there was absolutely there wasn't a hell of a lot of traction within the city to be able to do this. The last I know is that the engineering department at DUT developed a metal roof to go over the building to stop it decaying. And I haven't had the courage to go back, put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was one of those sort of significant life stresses when you're sort of saying, here's this fantastic project. But my PhD supervisor, who was an Indian woman who had studied, her PhD was in South Africa, she said, you probably find the lack of political will is because those particular politicians want to be able to be seen to say, we did it first, rather than the actual original endeavors which came out of the mission, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think this was really around party politics in Maritzburg in the early 2000s.
Okay. Sorry for all the people. You must be wondering what I'm doing. My lights go off in the office at work in order to save electricity. When they see no movement, they switch the lights off. So I got to keep on swinging my arms around to get the lights back on. Interestingly enough, you mentioned Bunny Bula, and Bunny has recently, together with a whole lot of stakeholders, launched what they call the Liberation Route. That I would imagine takes in a lot of what you are speaking about. As a person in architecture, how can tourism, seeing that there's no political will from political parties, is there any hope for tourism to be able to save these important historical structures from simply disappearing?
So that was always my premise. And I mean, I worked very closely with Bunny for a number of years. I took tours out to Edendale occasionally. My entire premise was that this entire village could actually thrive on tourism and tourism development. Part of the project that we did was actually training some local people in tourism. But the frustrating thing, and this also is connected with a similar project I've been working on since 2007 at Mpopomeni, which is the old house of Charles Lund. It originally was also, ironically, an Andries Pretorius site. But this house of Charles Lund was expropriated in the early 60s in order to set up Mpopomeni. And he shot himself in the house rather than lose his land. And so the nuanced story of Mpopomeni has also got these political layers which are intersectional. And the project at Mpopomeni has exactly the same struggles that the project in Maritzburg has. Mm-hmm. And it's around social cohesion, it's around political will. And even though at the moment the municipal manager and the Umgeni leadership are keen to engage, they've also got to focus. And the big challenge is money. Money is the key. And my sort of understanding of trying to do a sort of grassroots development is also predicated on being able to get access to quite significant grant funding to grow the project from below. And that has always been the nub of the problem. So it's the political will at the top, but not being able to push it from below because there's just not enough money. Okay. Museum services was also a big challenge, because museum services was quite paradigmatic in what they would fund and what they saw as being important. And so they were also not particularly keen to celebrate something which came before the ANC leadership in 94, even though Edendale was one of the birthplaces of the ANC itself.
Yeah.
So okay. it's a really complex sort of muddle of different issues.
Yeah, you know, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, you know, when you just want to throw your hands up in the air because you don't know what to do, maybe the Paton Center and, you know, its focus on struggle archives, etc. And, you know, in an age where universities are always looking for third stream income,
oh God, yes.
maybe they should start running tours, you know, to these areas, because sometimes with these kind of tours, you need an institutional type of clout.
Absolutely.
In order to make these tours. Whereas if you just get an entrepreneur and you say we train tour guides, you know, it doesn't have the same traction.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I'm just saying, and you know, when I heard you speak about James Allison, the one thing that struck me was almost the similar nature of his life, and in terms of Francis Fanner at Marion Hill. And I wanted to find out, because you never really told us, why was James Allison expelled from Edendale?
So I sort of alluded to it. So he was basically, he split Edendale up into plots. and everybody on the mission would have a plot, and then they'd have to pay for their plots. And it was around the survey and the allocation of land that became one of the problematic issues for the missionaries, or for the Amakolwa that were living on the mission. What I'm really, you've just brought up France, Fanna. So I'm currently working on a project in the Underberg area, and so it's almost a parallel struggle with one of the Dumisa Amakosi trying to desperately get, didn't matter who. He was trying to get missionaries from Twalume, from the American mission, and then eventually he got the Trappists, who had quite a bit of financial traction behind them. And so Reichenau mission was set up in order to be able to work with the Dumisa people, the Duma, and these invidious positions that many of these chiefs found themselves in, needing to be substantiated with the mission, is for me a really interesting, yet another interesting intersection. And significantly, one of the things which have come quite strongly out of this is the number of people from Edendale who are buying property here, which I mentioned to you earlier. We're buying property around the Underberg area, but also how few of them actually had forced removals when other people in that area had forced removals. So I'm now trying to find out how much the nationalist government looked at people who were missionaries or mission people rather than people who were not necessarily were traditional people in terms of actioning the forced removals.
Right.
So that's one of my big conspiracy theories of the moment.
Okay. I'm aware that there might be people in the audience who have questions. So I'm not sure whether people in the audience can actually speak or whether they're only allowed to text. But if there is anyone with a question, feel free to type it out, and I'll just, if you can't speak, I'm not sure, Roshni, can participants speak or are they muted permanently? But anyway, if there are any questions, now would be a good time. But while people are still thinking about it, I'm going to ask another question if there's no one else who's got a question.
And Daryl, just to answer your question, they can do both.
Okay.
They can put it in the chat as well as
Okay.
yeah, they raise their hands. Pamela can unmute. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. No, thanks so much. So Debbie, I'm going to take you into a slightly different, because I'm trying to think about, how to sort of bring Edendale back to life, because in a way you've got to show people the significance of areas rather than it being seen as apartheid ghettos, and I wanted to find out in your research, did you come across articles on the musical heritage of Edendale?
Absolutely. I am the proud owner of a reasonably unlistenable CD of Xaluza. And so what I find really interesting about Xaluza is he's got a song called 1918 about the Spanish flu. And when COVID happened, you realize how invisible the Spanish flu is in documentary records. And one of the only things that I had was the CD of Xaluza with influenza. And so the musical history of Edendale, Gerard Bengu was based there for a long time. Andries Pretorius's house was moved by the nationalists from Edendale to the Msunduzi Museum, I think in the 1980s or the 1970s. It's these layers of, then there was Richard Treman Mazibuko, who was a really important person in terms of early understanding of environmental techniques and growing in Edendale as well. So there were a whole series of people with really that were really important contributions to the history of Pietermaritzburg.
I mean, you're teaching me something absolutely.
Mm.
I never knew that they moved the Pretorius house from Edendale. Did they do it brick by brick?
Brick by brick. And so what you see at the Msunduzi Museum used to be in Edendale, and the drawings of the removal are sitting at the archives in Maritzburg.
Sure.
So yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. You know, Pietermaritzburg, really, we're sitting on so much, and we don't realize it. But I also wanted to say that, you know, this is the Alan Paton lecture, and Alan Paton was a literary scholar as well. And, you know, for anyone who might be in the audience, what struck me was your evocative description of the banishment of Langa Libalele, and how across the river he would watch his daughters grow up. And as a novelist, I think that is such a wonderful, a kind of seed for a novel. You know, it would be a beautiful exploration, an imaginative exploration.
No, absolutely. I mean, you know, absolutely. And I think this is, you know, and you put that together with, if you were on the mission, you had to wear Western clothes. And if you were moving, if Teta Leko went to visit people at the mission, he'd have to take off his bare shoe and put on Western clothes and cross to the mission. So there's also sartorial implications of movement between both.
Okay.
So there was a question there.
There's a question of it. It says, my question is, before Andries Pretorius was allocated the farmland, which later became Edendale, were there people living in that space? If yes, who are these people, or how was the place like? Okay,
so this is where we start getting into the thorny discussion about what the lawyers call terra nullius. So originally, the person who was the chief in the particular area was a woman called Matrabise. And Matrabise was, I believe, quite an important person. This was in the early 1820s. And between the 1822 and 1823, there was a southerly movement of the Mtembu and the Mchunu people. And this was part of the sort of early movements of the Mfecane. And many of the people from the Edendale area and the general Richmond area moved south and became what we call today the Batra. And so it basically left this sort of empty space, which was then populated by people again moving south. But certainly when Andries Pretorius was allocated land, this was in about 1838. So it was in the time of, sort of at the end of the time of Dingaan. And people that would have been living there would have possibly been whoever were refugees moving south from Zululand. So these are part of these really complex land histories about which Senzo knows a huge amount.
Okay, and he's sitting there quietly.
Absolutely.
Okay, but I just wanted to ask one last question. I assume that when you say that James Allison bought land, that he actually bought it from
The colonial
Oh, this
government.
colonial
Yeah,
government,
yeah.
not from the African people.
Yes, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
So,
No, that
sorry,
is
Darren.
absolutely okay. Senzo, you go ahead.
I'm sorry to disturb you. What I found from the archives here at Campbell, when the first settlers arrived at that area of Pietermaritzburg, they found people who were paying tribute to the Ngobo chief. I think the area was preoccupied by the Ngobo chief before it became the Voortrekker land or farms.
Okay. No,
Because there was
thanks.
also the Wushe.
Okay.
Okay.
So there's so much to uncover,
Mm.
but as a person who I don't know if you know, but I've done 3 books on churches of South Africa,
Mhm.
and but I didn't know about this important church in Edendale, and when I go home, that's one of the first things that I'm going to, and I'll be a bit braver than you. You said you didn't want to go for fear of maybe seeing it's been washed away, but I'm going to look.
Fantastic. So the interesting thing about the church is it was built with handmade bricks with mud from the Msunduzi River. So put that into your mental pot when you're thinking about it.
Okay. No, but Shoba Harku asks, you mentioned the Indians living in Edendale. Were they part of the indentured Indians?
Sure, but my assumption is that perhaps their ancestors or their sort of fathers and grandfathers may have well been indentured, but certainly the Indians that were living in Edendale at the time were largely traders. And so some of the trading stores, when you go through Edendale now, that you see have been burnt out, were stores belonging to Indian traders.
Okay, well,
Daryl, you have succeeded in dragging out stuff from a very long time ago. So,
well, I am
I
a
have-
Pietermaritzburg person, and it's as you said, the discourse is so disparate that one never gets to really talk about, the kind of things that you talk about in your paper, and it's a pity that I'm teaching English and Afrikaans, but because as a tourism person, I would be taking tours to Edendale, all the time. There's another question from Kulakani. Thank you, Prof, for the lecture. Is anything known about Reverend Allison's life and work in Mpilweni after he had left Edendale?
Kulekani, I do know that Tlamuka, Dr. Tlamuka, who is he's the CEO of Amafa, that he did his PhD in Mpilweni. And I have a suspicion that he has actually published a book, or he's in the process of publishing a book. So it might be worthwhile getting hold of Mkhulisi for that, because I do think that these connections are important. And, as I said, they are uncomfortable histories, but I think that all of our histories as South Africans are uncomfortable at different times and different places. So if you want, I'll just put in Mkhulisi.
Okay.
So I've put that into the chat for you.
Okay. But Debbie, it's been such a privilege to chat to you, to think that we were literally 10 kilometers apart for most of our working lives, and we never met.
Absolutely.
And now we are about 17,000 kilometers apart, and by computer we are now seeing each other. But it's been an absolute privilege, being the respondent to your paper, and as a person who has a deep affection for Pietermaritzburg and an interest in churches, especially, I will definitely be reading your work with a fine eye to see if I can uncover some of those wonderful mud bricks that you speak about so eloquently.
Thank you very much for listening to my rather garbled and rambled presentation, and I hope that thank you for pulling out some of the stuff that I wanted revealed. But I do think it's also significant, and this is also useful for you too, perhaps, is that Pietermaritzburg and Lincoln, where I live, were twin cities since about 1943. So there is an estate in Lincoln which has got Pietermaritzburg Street, Edendale View, Natal Road, and in the same way that in Maritzburg, we've got Lincoln Mead and Grimthorpe and all of those. So the connection between Maritzburg and Lincoln was around the cathedral, but also around the scale of the city and the fact that it is a city within a largely agricultural area. So that's another little bit of information you didn't know about.
I didn't know about it. And, just yesterday I was looking at a house in Lincoln Mead, and there you go, serendipity. That is what I think it is. But it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And I hope that members of the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. My arms are a bit weak now after wagging my arms around to keep the lights on. But over to you now, Roshni.
Thank you very much, David.
Okay.
Thank you. Senzo, we'll call on Senzo to close for us. Senzo.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this annual lecture. I would like to, on behalf of the University of KwaZulu-Natal and Library Management Team, it is my pleasure to propose the vote of thanks for the Alan Paton Annual Lecture. I would like to extend heartfelt thanks to the guest speaker, Professor T.P. Whelan, for her insightful lecture. Your insights have been invaluable, and we are grateful for her time and expertise. Your responses really resonate deeply with me. I would like to express my sincere thanks to all attendees, delegates, for their participation and enthusiasm. Professor Darrell Davis, our facilitator today, our director, Dr. Nonhlanhla Ngcobo, the Director of Library Services and Special Collections at UKZN, Mrs. Pamela Adam from UKZN Corporate Relations. She has been assisting us since we started organizing this lecture. Thank you very much, Pamela. Our dedicated organizing team from the library, specifically the staff members at the Alan Paton Center and Kelly Campbell Africana Library. Your contribution have made this. As we close this year's lecture, I encourage everyone to reflect on the insights shared today and carry forward the spirit of inquiry and dialogue into your work and studies. Wishing you a joyous festive season. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senzo, and thank you everybody for listening, and I hope you did learn something.
We learned a lot. We learned more than we would have learned in a 3-year degree.
Oh, really? You flatter me. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Darrell. Thank you, colleagues.
Okay. Thanks so much, then.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
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 Okay, everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Got to go for another meeting, so I shall see you. Thank you so much, Dan. Okay,
we'll keep in touch.
Okay,
bye.
thanks, and bye-bye.
Kat, will you close the meeting? Thank you.